Hi everybody, and welcome to topic 4 of Research Methods, and I hope things are going well for you in the unit. Get in contact if you need to discuss anything on the discussion forum, by email, in class, in Collaborate. I hope to see you all there and talk more about the topic of this week, which is research practices and ethics. And I guess the reason that these two themes are linked this week is that in any field of practice, there are ethics, and there's an ethos to our practice. And the idea of this week is to make research practices and their ethical dimensions explicit, and to think about those and how they might have a important role in our particular research that we're doing in our degrees. So I guess research ethics and research ethics is germane to all research, in that sense that it's important in all research. Often at university, a lot of the discussion around research ethics revolves around ethics committees and ethics applications, and so that's seen as the focus of research ethics. However, in our discussion today, we're going to broaden that to incorporate all research, and I guess propose the argument that all research has an ethical dimension. One of the reasons for this is that research has the capacity to change lives, our own and others, and so it's important to think about how we conduct research for those reasons. But I guess even in addition to that, all research requires some decision about what it is we're going to research and why we're researching. Maybe who we're researching, and the purposes of the research. And so in that way, there's an ethical dimension to the choices we make at all levels in our research. Why do one piece of research rather than another, for example? How do our choices of the types of research we're going to do have that sort of ethical dimension? In Australia, there's, I guess most research ethics discussions begin with this thing called the National Statement on Ethical Conduct in Human Research, which I guess is the defining document produced by the National Health and Medical Research Council, NHMRC. And they talk about ethical conduct in these terms, that it's more than simply doing the right thing. It involves acting in the right spirit, so there's our research practice, out of an abiding respect and concern for one's fellow creatures. Something more fundamental than ethical do's and don'ts, namely an ethos that should permeate the way those engaged in human research approach all that they do in their research. Today we might consider whether we're just going to limit this to human research, whether there's an ethical dimension to all research, and I think that we could say yes, there is, in that sense that all research involves practices which engage in the world and have the capacity to change it, so I'm going to try and keep this discussion today short, so I'm going to resist that urge that I have to sort of keep going on. I guess in research, I think researchers will have always understood that there's an ethical dimension to research. But in terms of formalising the ethics around research, there's been an ethical turn which I guess we could probably chart commencing after the Second World War, and especially in relation to medical research that was conducted in by the Nazi regime in its in Europe, in Germany, in other places, I guess in death camps. Pardon me, and especially on Jewish people, but anybody who was deemed to be somehow or other lesser than less than human. And so the research that was conducted by the Nazis was exposed in the after World War II in the Nuremberg trials, and the questions of benefit and harm became important questions and exposed to the light. How do we conduct research in such a way that that the benefits and harms of the research itself are in balance? So this resulted in a range of national statements on ethics, such as the one that I just quoted from before, especially in the field of medicine and clinical trials and things like that. But it started to become a broader topic from the 1970s when feminist researchers started to talk about bias in research that we covered in the discussion last week, by so-called subaltern researchers, that is, people of colour, often researchers who began to investigate post-colonialism, often on the subcontinent, on the Indian subcontinent, but elsewhere as well. And then a whole range of ethics that comes out of critiques from groups who are marginalised and their role in research, their participation in research, and being the subject of research. And so this influence then developed a more nuanced approach to research ethics that I guess is the one that we're sort of going to try and pick up today. An example of this is in Australia, which is very important to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, comes through this idea of Indigenous research. Tuawai Smith, a New Zealand academic and researcher, wrote a seminal text on this, on research and Indigenous peoples, and the role of research and universities and theory and ideas supporting colonialism. That is, that there's an imperial history of knowledge production. And so Indigenous research in that sense understands that there's underlying ethical issues that need to be addressed in research. That last week we talked about how research can be often display patriarchal values. I guess Indigenous researchers talked about the ethnocentrism of research and how research can be used to justify, and has been used in history, and we could argue still today, to justify social inequality, to maintain the status quo rather than change the status quo, change the way things are. So Indigenous researchers, in that sense, wanted to change the ethos of research, especially research that involves Indigenous people, taking control of the research agenda, what type of questions are asked, who participates, how people participate in research, who participates even at the point of asking the research questions, became a key part of the agenda for Indigenous research. Who benefits from the research? That is is this something that just benefits majority groups who, for example, get their PhD, get their honours, get their qualifications, and the participants are left in the same position as they always have been. So Indigenous research acknowledges that there's axiological issues around what questions are asked of whom and for whose benefit, and that there are protocols to be followed, cultural protocols to be followed and respected when engaging in research with Indigenous people. So I guess the key term there, I think for me, is that with. That is not research about, but research with. How do we think about research with Indigenous people rather than it being about Indigenous people if we were going to be conducting research in this area? So I guess for all of us, this raises some axiological issues around what the ultimate value of research is and its ends, what the values are that are embedded in our approach to research, and acknowledging this influence that has come down to us from feminist and this term subaltern researchers on our methodologies. So thinking about values, and all of us have some underlying values in our research, and being explicit about them, I guess, is important. I guess in the discussion on paradigms, we can also see that there's an issue around values in there. We talked about there being axiological aspect to all those paradigms, and so this is just expanding on that and bringing it into an ethical dimension. So this idea of research with others, of thinking of, if we're talking about research with people, and it's called human research in the jargon of research ethics. One of the key things I guess we need to think about is relationships, the relationships with participants. And if we're not engaged in so-called human research, but we're researching other things, we might be thinking about participants in a wider sense here. And so for me, this came home when I was doing some research on non-Indigenous activists in Lismore in the 1950s and 60s, and I had the privilege of doing some interviews with Tess and Vic Brill, and Tess Brill in particular, who was active in the 1950s and 1960s in Lismore as a Indigenous rights activist, and the importance of careful consideration of ethics was so important in establishing a relationship with Tess, because in the past she had had interactions with researchers who basically took knowledge and she never heard from them again, and didn't know where the information ended up. Sort of, I guess, almost like a mining operation, an extractive operation, extracting data, taking it away, and that was the end of it. So Tess was quite concerned to talk to me about ethics, the ethics of research and the importance of that. And so fortunately I was prepared, because I did need to prepare an ethics application. It brought home to me the importance of the ethics application process, but also considerations of ethics in research in general, because it was a key part of establishing a relationship between a research participant and me as a researcher, as a new researcher, who sort of was coming to grips with these things. So Tess was, as is often the case with research participants, one step ahead of me as a researcher. That is, she already knew the importance of these things and needed to teach me about the importance of these things. Often as researchers, we're following the people who we're researching. They're the experts in what they know and their relationship with the world, and we're following them. So there's another, I guess, ethical issue there around ourselves as knowledgeable people, as researchers from the university, and how we think of ourselves and position ourselves in relation to our participants, and thinking about them as these people as participants in research, not as subjects of research. Some of the key ethical agreements that we can have with participants are around things such as voluntary participation. That is, that someone can, or decline being part of our research. That, I guess, we're not compelling. People can't be compelled. And in fact, as Bill Boyd, who is a chair of the ethics committee at Southern Cross University, has said, we need them more than they need us. Their lives will continue regardless of us being, regardless of being researched or not. But for us, their participation is important, and so we need to recognise that. Another principle, I guess, is no harm to participants. And this comes down to, I guess, this issue of harm or risk and benefit. And we could ask the question whether there's never a risk in research, and we'll talk about that in a little while. But basically, that risks are explained up front, and that there's informed consent. That's what informed consent, I guess, is that we're disclosing to people the possible harms that may result from our research, and also where the research is going to end up, how they might be represented in that research, their role in that whole process. So being informed about the research process and our purposes for that research. Now, sometimes these things are up for discussion and can be considered on a case-by-case basis and emphasised or de-emphasised, or even sometimes there may be a case for not informed consent, but in the main, we're going to be going down this road of informed consent. Anonymity and confidentiality are important also to be discussing with research participants. That is, whether they will remain anonymous, de-identified, the confidentiality of the data, the raw data that we collect on them, and how that's going to be kept. And being, I guess, not deceptive in our conduct as researchers, that is, that we're clear on our intent. And so I guess one of the questions we can ask is, are any of these agreements important in your researcher-participant relationships? So if we're doing research that involves people, then these agreements are something to be explicit about and to think carefully about. The National Statement on Ethical Conduct in Human Research, I guess, is a statement that's useful for everybody to read, because it's a really good document to get clear on how research can be of any type can be conducted and constructed and discussed, thinking carefully about our aims, our objectives, our methods, and so forth, in order that when we involve people in research, that we're not involving them in poorly constructed research that won't achieve the outcomes that we hope it will, that will answer the questions that we have, that will address the problems, however we want to frame that, but that we're not just putting people to some inconvenience at the least for no real benefit. So that's what this national statement does, and it advocates best practice and guidelines for dealing with breaches of this as well, and formalises this through ethics committees which are set up at each university and other research institutes and places where research is conducted around Australia. So these research committees have an oversight of research ethics and of any research which involves people. So if your research involves people, you will need to engage with the ethics committee. If your research doesn't directly involve people, then you're not needing to go to the ethics committee, but ethical considerations are still important for you, and so as I've already mentioned. The definition, I guess, of this idea of human research, which is quite a medical way of talking about people, isn't it? So, we might not talk about human research so much as research that involves others, involves people, is defined in this statement. And so these definitions are important because I guess they help us determine as researchers whether we need to apply for an ethics clearance or not through the ethics committee. So doing a survey, so anything that involves people in surveys of any type, any testing or treatments, being observed by researchers. There's an ethical dimension to being observed, and so therefore how we're going to do that is of an interest to ethics committees. Having access to personal documents and other material, collection of pieces of bodies, including exhaled breath. So I don't think many of us would be doing that, but you never know. And having access to information that might be identifiable or re-identifiable, that's already existing and might be unpublished or published. If we're using that information about people, then we need to consider the ethics of that as well. So anything that could be connected to a person as an individual or as a group needs to be considered more formally in your ethics, in the ethical aspects of your research. The guidelines, the national statement, I guess, has some values that underpin our relationship with research participants, and again note that term, the relationship between researchers and research participants, not research subjects. That is, whether our research has merit and integrity. That is it justifiable? Is it well designed? This comes to our rationale. That is, why do this research? Is it important to do it? Why are we involving people and their time in this? Is it just research? That is, if justice, I guess, is it without an undue burden on a particular group. Now, as we mentioned earlier with Indigenous research methodologies, there's a key concern as to the undue burden that Aboriginal people and Torres Strait Islanders have felt with regard to research over centuries. There's that claim that's often made that Aboriginal people in Australia are the most studied people. And so a lot of people have made their careers, a lot of academics and others have made their careers researching Aboriginal people. But to what end? Have Aboriginal people benefited from this research? How does this compare with social well-being and statistics around that? How come this research hasn't resulted in benefits for Aboriginal people in that sense? So this idea of undue burden is a key one, and so and will be a factor, as we will see, in terms of justifying our research. That is, that idea of research merit and integrity. And it also has a bearing on beneficence, that is, how risk and harm is balanced by benefit. So it's a key aspect here. And I guess finally, respect for the people who we're engaging with. How are participants empowered? In a way, we might think of what is our underlying model of a research participant. How do we see them? Do we see them as active and engaged people, or do we see them as passive conveyors of information to us to be used? So how are participants empowered through the research is another question around respect. So each of these things I think we could think about in our own research, regardless of what it is that we're doing, human or otherwise, I think, in terms of merit and integrity. That's what we're asking you for in terms of saying what's the rationale for your research. Thinking about justice, beneficence, respect for human beings. How does this relate to your own research? And how might you talk about that in your own terms? Just moving on then to the more formal aspects of research ethics. If you read through that and think, yes, I'm involved in, my research could be categorized as human research, then you will need to engage with the ethics committee at university before you start doing any research. So that's the key thing with this, that this oversight by the ethics committee needs to happen prior to any research being conducted. And there's two types of application that can be made at university. There's what's known as a full application. That is, and I'll explain that a little bit more further down the track, or an expedited application. Now, if you're conducting honours research, we're expecting that you would be doing an expedited application, basically because it's not as an involved process as a full application, it's quicker, but also because an expedited application is completed and submitted for low risk or negligible risk research. And because honours is a research training degree, then low risk or negligible risk research is a type of research that you should be doing if you're involving human participants. I'm going to use the terms of the Ethics National Statement here. The applicant for this undertaking the research, for preparing the research application, is going to be normally your supervisor. Oh, and I should just mention that if you're doing Masters or PhD, then clearly you may be requiring to do a full ethics application. You may not as well. You may also be doing a low risk or negligible risk, or therefore expedited application. It will depend on the nature of your research, and we'll explore this more. So the applicant will be your supervisor, somebody who is permanently employed by the university, and then you will be sort of listed on that application as a researcher, and in fact, not only that, you'll be doing the work of putting the application together. Your supervisor clearly will be overseeing that and checking through it, because they're going to be the applicant in that sense. They're responsible for the ethical conduct of your research. There'll be a review by the committee of your research application. There's committees at all places in their CU campuses. The full committee looks at full applications, and there's a subcommittee that looks after the expedited applications to make that a quicker process. And these applications will be either approved with conditions. There may be a further request before approval can be granted, or for comment, and sometimes, very rarely, there'll be rejection, but rejection happens only in very rare cases. Usually there's a bit of a process. If there's anything that's going to happen, it will be either approval straight away, or with some questions and conditions required. So I guess because when people do prepare their ethics applications, they're preparing a good one. They're putting together worthy research proposals to the committee. So I guess the questions in terms of this are, and especially around whether you need to do a full application, which is called a NEAF, National Ethics Application Form. I think that's just from memory, but let's go with that. I guess this is a little flow chart that tells you whether you want to do an expedited application or whether you're going to need to do a full application, also known as the NEAF. So, you're doing human research, yes or no? If you're not doing human research, you don't need to do an ethics application. So that's sort of how you're going to involve people in your research, if they're directly involved in your research, through all those ways we talked about earlier. If it's yes, the next question is at low or negligible risk. If it's low or negligible risk, then you're going to use the expedited process. If it's not low or negligible risk, then you're going to need to do a full ethics application using the NEAF. So, National Ethics Application Form, I've got it on the slide, I should have just read it. So that's the thing. Now, this idea of risk, how do we determine that? Well, I guess risk is determined in a number of ways. First of all, in terms of low risk or negligible risk. Low risk means that there's the only foreseeable risk of your research is going to be some discomfort. So that may be psychological discomfort, depending on what type of questions you're asking people. So there's a question around that as to, what is it that you're researching? What might the impacts of your research questions be on people? That's one aspect to do with the actual sort of topic or content and process method of the research. Negligible research means that there's the foreseeable risk is inconvenience. That is, it's going to involve something, 5 minutes of somebody's time, an hour of somebody's time, that type of thing. What you can see here is that what it's saying is that for any research that involves people, there's no such thing as a no-risk project. There's always a risk of some type to the group, that is some inconvenience. I guess in this sort of sense, risk equates to some type of cost on the participants' behalf. If it goes to discomfort, then there's something else, I guess, over and above inconvenience that's involved there. And both of these ideas are defined in further detail in the national statement. So it's not, but however, determining risk isn't just about those two factors, that is, about the research methods and what people are involved in regarding the method. It also is determined by whether vulnerable groups are involved in research as well. Vulnerable groups, I can't get the word out, are outlined in part 4 of the national statement. You can see them listed here. So I guess ones that might need some explanation is the idea of dependent and unequal relationships. So this could be where we're engaging with people who may be dependent on others in daily life, or where there's some sort of power relation issue. That could be around, for example, domestic violence, but it also could be vulnerability in terms of homelessness, a range of factors that we could imagine speak of, emblematic of unequal relationships, unequal power relations, that may put people, ask that question, whose benefit is the research, who benefits from this research, why conduct it, why involve this group of people. Obviously, those highly dependent on medical care who may be unable to give consent has an impact on the informed consent process that goes to cognitive impairment. Anybody who might be involved in illegal activities where our research may involve some disclosure, which as researchers puts us in a position of knowing something that maybe needs to be disclosed, and therefore is of harm to the person being who is part of the research. I was going to say being researched. So, thinking about illegal activities in this sense. And the other one is Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander peoples. So again, this is emphasising that issue before that Indigenous researchers have raised in their work and in their analysis of research. Now, all of these areas, especially with Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander peoples, there is some room for movement there, and that's where some careful discussion needs to be had with your supervisor, with often the chair of the ethics committee, just to talk about what the issues might be. So there are instances where Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples may be involved in a research project, and through the nature of their participation, they're not showing themselves as vulnerable, if you're not, in that sense. In fact, they're agents in the research. And so there's always a case-by-case discussion to be had around these things, but you're getting the idea of the types of considerations around whether you need to do a full application or not, and what you should be thinking about. For information on this, there's a Division of Research who has a link to all ethics information. And I guess there's a number of questions you could ask yourself about this. I guess one is, from your current understanding, what aspects and principles of ethics in research are important to your project? What are these considerations? If you think that you have no ethical considerations in your research around human participation in particular, but in general, explain why not. And it's something to be explicit about. I guess for those people who think they may need ethics approval for their projects, then answer these questions. Why do you need approval? If you're an honours student, but regardless, I guess, is your research low or negligible risk? If it's not, how might you modify? If you're an honours student and it doesn't seem to be low or negligible risk, how might you modify your project so that it's no longer high or medium risk? And then see what the ethics approval form requires and start working on it. So often because we're engaging in research methods, this is a good time to be starting on this process of ethics application if you need to do one. So that's sort of, I guess, the gist of this week. Again, I've gone, I don't know, I just can't get under 30 minutes. Why is that? My apologies for that. I'll see you in class. Looking forward to seeing you again this week and to talk about ethics and research practices in particular. So see you soon. Have a good week. Bye-bye.